Hey everyone, welcome to today's webinar. I'm sorry we're starting a minute late. Talking about 243 today, and Cory and I are already debating stuff and lost a little track of time. Today we have Cory Johnson, who's a specialist with the Safety Partnerships Division at FRA. I'm glad to have Cory here. We've been working with him, Cory, on the 243 team for quite some time. And then myself, Katie Inouye. The focus today is refresher training. I've been getting a lot of questions in the last 3 months on refresher training from Class 1, as well as from short lines and even from a few contractors. It's a good opportunity since we're in this first cycle. We're both in this first cycle, whether you're a Class 1 or a short line right now, to talk about refresher training. And Cory, thanks for joining us so we can pick your brain on what you're seeing and what things you think people should know when thinking about refresher training. Okay, to the content for today. I sometimes forget the cycles myself because the deadlines and things have changed quite a bit. Cory, did they change twice or 3 times? I think 3. Oh, I just put you on the spot. 3 times, I think, maybe 2 times for sure. If you're 3 times?
I think
twice. Okay, it just feels like more. For the Class 1s, and if you're an inner city or commuter, the first refresher cycle needs to be completed at the end of 2024. With 243, it's a little different than some of the other refresher requirements where this is calendar year cycles versus 36 months. And then for all the other employers, and this would be contractors, whether regardless of size, and then the Class 2s and 3 railroads, you have until the end of 2025 in that refresher cycle. We'll talk about what that means. Certainly when we're talking about refresher cycles with 243, I don't want to forget that, and then this is from the compliance manual, I took a copy of it, but a lot of FRA regulations have different refresher training requirements that are shorter, right? Your on-track safety is going to be every calendar year, same with CWR. You're going to manage your conductors and engineers like you always have been. What else would be shorter? I don't know. But all of those things still apply. And some of them are 36 months versus the calendar years. So those all still apply. If there isn't a refresher requirement, that's where these 243 requirements come into play. One of the biggest questions I have, so I'm going to tee these things up and then we'll ask some questions to Cory, is on submission requirements. And I think this has come up in past speaking engagements with the FRA, with the Short Line Association, and just assumptions maybe some of us have made in the industry when we think about refresher trainings. It really is the same requirement as the initial training. In fact, I have a little page from the compliance manual here, and they call it out. The chart applies to both initial and refresher training. An easy rule of thumb, potentially, is if you had to submit something for initial training or you adopted a program for initial training, then you're going to have to do the same thing for refresher training. Now, I say that's potentially true because I look at a lot of plans and I talk to a lot of people about 243, and I would say 8 or 9 times out of 10, what people submit is over-submit, and they're not really, unless I did their plan and we walked through it and did the submission together, I often see that people over-submitted. The graphic on the page here, I'm jumping on my bullet points, but on that third bullet point, you don't see the deck. Thank you. Yeah. Let me go back. Let me just go back to the timeline. I think I talked through that and it's pretty obvious that this is from the compliance manual. And then let's dig into the refresher submission requirements. And thank you for the correction. The same refresher requirements. And what I'd say about pages 8 through 11 in the compliance manual is it's very specific on what you do not need to submit. And if you're using the Spark 243 template, there's a column that shows whether or not you have to submit something. Again, if you had to submit for initial, you'll need to do the same thing for refresher training. And I was going to add, and we have a question for Cory coming up here, but You may have adopted or submitted a program already for both initial and refresher training. And Cory, you and I talked about this ahead of time on some level, but my assumption is if you adopt a program and it was for initial and refresher and you're going to use it for refresher, you should not need to submit that again because it was adopted and submitted for both. Would you agree with that, Cory?
Yeah, to a point. The thing is, if you adopted a model program in its entirety, that tells us that you're using that whole program for your training. When it comes to refresher training, if you're only touching on parts of that or something like that, then I would recommend submitting that if it doesn't fall under the similar training program.
Yeah, if you're making
If you're making major modifications to it or something like that, I would recommend just submitting that. And I would suspect that most refresher submissions are probably going to be of the catalog type because they're probably going to touch on several different regulations. That might be something to look at because
yeah,
we know there's a lot of employers that adopted model programs in their entirety when they probably didn't mean to do that, because the way it was supposed to work is if you weren't using that whole program, say there was a subsection that didn't apply to your organization, you should have created a course modifying an approved program and then told us in that submission what didn't apply to your railroad or your company. We realized that a lot of people were under the gun. They just went in, adopted model programs in their entirety to get their approval letter and before the implementation date. What I've been telling people is whether you use the shoreline programs or whoever's, mark that up, keep it on hand, because if something does happen and we come in, whether it's an audit or an accident or whatever, and you have this model program that shows everything A through Z, and then we find out that you're not training on X or D, we're going to have an issue. But if you've got that marked up, at least that this section doesn't apply to your railroad or whatever, it's going to be easier for us to swallow. We don't
yeah.
expect everybody to go back in. The right thing would be to go back in, do a modified submission, then make that other one inactive. You can do that as well.
If I'm not using it for initial and refresher as it like if I, you're right, like a lot of people will adopt and comply in its entirety. If I want to change the refresher training, you want us to make that course inactive and then resubmit it as an initial and then submit the refresher separately?
No, you could, if it's,
Or
most
just
of
add
them
a,
are marked in refresher, so I just leave it and then submit a refresher.
yeah, okay. And then you'd imply that you're going to do the refresher. You could do an informational filing saying this one's just for initial and then do the refresher too.
You can do that, yes.
I will say it's true for people using Spark, like a lot of our knowledge-based or all of our knowledge-based content is going to be online. You guys aren't going to change. I would say with the exception of part 236, we did that as separate modules. You could take and leave those ones. You could amend those a little bit, but it's going to be all of its entirety. And I think the other thing, Cory, is I have a couple courses, and I know the association did this too, where I know JR did, I know the association did this, where they submitted their initial and refresher, but they included the on-the-job training checklist. But that's implied that's only initial, correct?
Yes.
Because I have a couple like that too, like our crane course, I think was submitted that way, and bridge worker safety potentially, where I submitted it with the checklist, did it as both, but implied, like to me, it was implied that the refresher portion would be minus the OJT. So I think that answers the
Yeah.
submission.
240, 43 doesn't require OJT for refresher. Doesn't say you can't do it or
Yeah, it'd be
go over and above.
call it something different, right? If you do OJT, to me, on the
Yeah,
job training,
not
it's
really.
I know it's semantics of training, but maybe field training or something like that. Not as OJT as it's defined in the regulation, I would say. Probably not.
Correct.
Yeah, really a good rule of thumb is if you had to submit it initially, you're gonna have to submit it for refresher, but gosh, I see so many people submitting a lot of stuff. Let's just say you were someone that went all in and you just submitted all the programs, whether it's the associations or Sparks or a combination of stuff. And now you're like, wow, I didn't really need to submit my 213 and 214 program and all those others. What I would recommend, and then Cory can correct me, but I would say go and make those courses inactive. That way you don't have FRA, it doesn't require a submission, you're making them inactive. That gives you some flexibility to change those, documented, of course, to Cory's point, and then focus on the ones that do require submission. Cory, are you okay with that? If I submitted 214 and I didn't need to, pulling it back?
Are you talking the one that was marked as initial and refresher?
Let's just say I'm Railroad ABC and I submitted Part 214 to you because I didn't understand it,
Right.
didn't need it. I don't mean to pick on Part 214. I can pick on something different. I submitted 214 is easy. Oh, hours of service. I submitted an hours of service program, and that doesn't require a submission. And now I want to change what I'm doing with hours of service. Instead of changing and doing all these submission things, can I just not make that inactive? Because you guys don't need to know what I'm doing in the portal on hours of service.
Yeah, you could do that.
So that's what I would do if I was a railroad and I over submitted, is I would go through and clean up my submission to pull back stuff that didn't need to be submitted. But when you guys work with us and we go through your OJT checklists, to Cory's point, and Cory, you've seen these in all our submissions, right? We strike out what doesn't apply to that company. And then they submit it to you. If it's a Signal OJT checklist and it's a Spark one, you'll see like the things that don't apply to them in it. If you're not submitting something and you're still making those changes, I agree with Cory. If you're using the model program, document that, strike those things out so that you know how you've changed the model program and how it, because FRA approved that model program and it's totally fine to remove stuff that doesn't apply to you, but it's good to know what you changed. Yeah. I know on the dispatcher program with the association, I've done stuff where we just go through and hide slides. You could hide the slides and then it's clear that those are the pieces of content you're not covering. Okay, enough on the submission. That is where we get most of the questions. So hopefully we've knocked that out enough. And then I guess the second question. So if every cycle, so like the class ones are wrapping up this first cycle of retraining, if they're going to do something different every time, let's say we have a track inspector refresher training, but we're going to focus on different topics every cycle. Should they just keep resubmitting that, make the old one inactive, and then the next cycle submit a new one? Is that what you guys are anticipating?
Yes. Yeah, that's what we expected, that their refresher would be different whenever. Some are doing it every year, some are doing it biannual.
Yes, there is that too. You can always do it more frequently, but then I tell you guys to not tell FRA that, just stick with the 3 years. Sorry, Cory, that's what I tell them.
Yeah, but if you're doing, some do certain regulations this year, certain ones that next year, then
That's
that
different.
has to be submitted.
That is
If they
different.
fall under the one submitted, but yeah, you're right.
Yeah, but I have some folks
Better
that
be open.
we do our rules training every
I would-
year. That's great. What? Say that
I
again?
just said it would be better to be open with us and submit it to us than not. And to be honest, we're not going to scrutinize refresher training as much as we did initial training. If you say this is what you're going to do, and there's probably jumping ahead here, but we say in the regulation that it should be data-based. You should be looking at all your data, your FRA inspection reports, your accident incident data, ops testing data, all that stuff to mold your refresher training. Who I can't sitting here at my desk looking at somebody's refresher and go, well, they must have obviously had a lot of ops test failures for this or whatever. I can guess that, but I can tell you, we're not going to go to the railroad and go to what's your justification for this refresher training?
I guess my thought is like for people that do, let's just say 230, like they're gonna do one topic. Like a lot of times people like to do rules training every year, but that really is only required every 3 years. We'll say blue signal, for instance, because that's a good 3-year requirement, rules based. I would submit it as every 3 years, and then if they're gonna do it extra, like to me, they're just going above and beyond, but they're telling you what they're gonna do for the minimum. That way, if something
Yeah,
happens, go ahead.
the other thing is we're gonna see a lot of that stuff just documented in employees' records, like hours of service. You talked about hours of service. The recurrent training requirement in hours of service is one, you're supposed to be monitoring your employees' hours of service. If you find issues, then you're supposed to do refresher training with them on that stuff. Somebody that's screwing up on hours of service, quite often, you might see 2, 3 entries on their record every year for 228 refresher training. That's the way I would document it, because
Well,
that's
yeah.
what it is. It's refresher.
To your point, though, you might do extra refresher training with an individual or maybe a location, and you might not do it system wide, right? So if you had somebody, sometimes it's not a system issue. Maybe you just have someone that's really struggling. That would go into the fact that, oh, this person's struggling with this. So to your point, we'll look at that for the bigger picture of refresher training. But having worked for a class 1 with accidents and incidents and things, and sometimes corrective action in those responses to FRA is refresher training, right, with those individuals or location. So it doesn't have to be a system-wide initiative.
You may do your system-wide hours of service once every 3 years,
Yeah.
or once a year or whatever. But
Yeah.
like 220 required that refresher to be documented in the past. 243 requires it to be documented.
We've got a good mix of participants on today's call on sizes of employers, both ends of the spectrum today. When we look at this compliance manual, yes, my class 1 railroad friends, this is exactly what they'll be doing. And they're doing those annual reviews. They're in their annual reviews, they're combining this data with kind of a summary piece that will inform refresher training. And I believe that a lot of us did that prior to 243 in some ways in the class 1 space, like on rules. When having been the person that helped design some of those like we would talk about that and what are we going to do this year for rules training on refresher. But now I've got the other end of the spectrum, and I see short lines on the call that are mid-size, but I have a couple on here that have a couple people. And in that case, yes, FRA is saying this, but it may be more realistic that you do just the full initial training, or maybe you don't have enough data, so you just think of where the highest risk is. And like some of that initial training is stuff that is everybody knows, like the palm of the back of their hand kind of stuff. I don't know. Cory, do you have any thoughts on like sizes of railroads and the strategy? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it really can be about anything. The biggest goal is that there is refresher training going on.
Yeah. But if they have an accident or incident or an injury, fatality, and the data show that their efficiency testing program had a bunch of defects in X, and then in shoving, They had a bunch of failures in efficiency testing and shoving, and then they have a shoving incident, and they didn't do refresher training on shoving. I just want to give some, you say you guys don't care, but if all that happened in the accident investigation, it's going to come up that refresher training on shoving was missed.
True. Yes.
So.
Yeah, I guess to backpedal a little bit is yes, we would be looking at that. Or maybe there's a complaint or whatever. We come in, start looking, then we are going to look at your testing data, things like that, to determine if you're using that information to adjust your training.
They do have a bunch of flexibility, but I just want for those on the call within reason, right? You can't just shorten the training without being thoughtful behind it and having a reason of why you're not doing the full scope. As somebody, so my background is in instructional design. I have a master's degree in training and development. And I always said building refresher training programs, you know, for the class ones, we can go and cover it all and we'll just talk. I'll just pick track inspection. Part 213 is a huge regulation. There's a lot to cover. We can do a day-long refresher stuff with our track inspectors. We're just going to hit everything at a high level. Or we can take a couple topics and do something really meaningful and go deeper. And that's when you're doing the couple of topics, you're going deeper and more meaningful. That's when you want to be thoughtful in what topics you're picking. Like where have we had our track defects? Where are our biggest risks? Maybe we haven't had a lot of defects, but if we had a defect, it would be a big risk. I prefer, as an instructional designer, the deeper and more meaningful conversations than the shotgun approach where you're just throwing a whole bunch of stuff out and it's at the surface level because there's only so much time devoted to it. That's the instructional designer's opinion in me on this. I'm going to backpedal a little bit myself because we jumped around a little bit on these slides. Scope of content, this is also just a lot easier than the strategy that Cory and I have been talking about because there is a lot of wiggle room and room for you guys to figure out what's right for your organization. And this is in the compliance manual. There's FRA put this together with all these citate like extra notes. Go to the compliance manual and read all of that. These are regulations that are listed with already having refresher training requirements in it. We've talked about a few of these already, especially the ones that have that calendar year, like parts 213 and CWR anyways, and then 214 with on-track safety. But the thing about 213 is track safety standards as a whole did not. So now having the thoughtful 3-year cycle for track safety standards is important. Cory, you brought up 228 with if there's showing a problem with entering hours of service, it required recurrent training, but I would say now with 243, you probably should do it every 3 years. That one's unique. But so that's that piece. And then thanks to Cory for pointing this out this morning, but part 232 and part 238 specifically call out that there needs to be classroom refresher training. And when people ask me about refresher training, I quick rattle off some of these regulations, maybe not STEAM. I have a couple of folks now who are customers that are in the STEAM world, but I should have added part 236. It's here because of PTC, I bet. But our signal maintainers on wayside signals wouldn't have been. I would add that.
Subpart H and I have training requirements in them, but everything else doesn't.
Yeah, I normally would. So I basically looked at this chart and did what's missing, but I would list part 236 for that reason. Because I'm talking about it, I noticed that. So here's things that, like our mechanical group, like we were doing recurrent training before 243 on rules, or we should have been. But what about freight car safety standards? And we were doing it on single car air brake tests, right? And 232 air brake tests in general. But 215 is a big regulation for the carman that now needs to be under 243. And same thing with part 229 and 231. And then the two signal ones, which please write a note, and I'm gonna update this PowerPoint, but part 236 on wayside signals is a huge one. And then I would look at your submission, not your submission, but your plan to see what gaps are there. This slide, let me tweak a little bit. We talked about this. Did we miss a question? No. Talked about strategy. What questions did we have on strategies? Testing out, Cory. This has been a conversation for several years. Can we test out of training requirements?
Short and sweet, no. So what the thought was to use your ops testing data or your periodic oversight data to basically show that your employees knew what they were doing. No, we're not allowing that. One major reason is you're probably not testing every employee on everything they apply and their day-to-day, especially you get into like signal and things like that. Most ops testing plans, programs do not cover their performing signal tests and things like et cetera.
Yeah, and efficiency testing's been like a hard no from you guys for consistently for a couple of years, I would say, from the beginning. I don't think FRA ever considered that efficiency testing would replace refresher training. But even like a written exam, my impression of what is published right now in the NPRM, and the final rule hasn't been published, but my impression is giving someone a multiple choice exam also would be a no. And what I tell people, Cory, yeah, and the reason I tell people that is it doesn't meet the definition of formal training. So we're talking about refresher training. Part 243 defines formal training, and refresher training needs to be a form of formal training, but needs to have a duration and learning objectives, like a delivery method and an exam of some sort. Would you agree with that?
Yes. Yeah. When the preamble and stuff talks about the need for this stuff, that's what it goes into, and pretty much in depth as what training should look like and things like that. And so.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And then, like I said, the formal training piece. The second question, I don't mean to give you a trick question about Railtasker checklists, but thoughts on using Railtasker for refresher training?
Yeah, and we discussed this quite a bit. Basically, like we talked, it wouldn't be really OJT, but yet it is. It's the OJT tasks. But I just think, like you mentioned, there's a couple of regulations that require classroom training. I just think that there's things that you couldn't really use the task checklists for that to satisfy that.
It's a trick question right now because I don't have it submitted and approved by you.
Yeah.
Or not you personally, but by FRA, it might be you. But what I would say to those using Railtasker is my intention is to be thoughtful about that, and then I will submit to FRA checklists that I think could potentially be candidates for refresher training, not because it's a checklist, but because the intention would be we would meet the formal training requirement by doing demonstrations in the field, reviewing key concepts. There'd be learning objectives, there'd be a duration, and you would document that training with hands-on assessment using the checklist tool. And to Cory's point, not everything, FRA is not going to like that for everything, but I think if we're thoughtful about it, and I think where we have the most need in the industry, I think there's a chance that if it's truly formal training, it could be, but I guess we need to let FRA assess it and approve it before we know for sure. Is that fair?
Yep.
Yeah,
I don't think, I'm not going to say it's a hard no.
Yeah, so as a conversation I'm currently having with them, but I haven't gotten I don't have the approval letter to show you guys all right now. So I think we just wait and see. I think there's a chance that for some things that could get approved. how long, we've talked about this, but I get this question all the time. Are you guys looking for a minimum? For instance, if my initial training was a day long, are you guys looking for it should be X long, like length?
No, I don't really think so. That's something you tell us in the program. If we got questions about it, we'd raise them with the submitter, but
Yeah,
we see
go ahead.
we see all kinds of different, even on initial. And,
Yeah,
I've questioned, like, I get 213 initial programs and they say they do it in 6 hours. And I'm like, whoa, there must not be much discussion in this because that's a big rule to cover in 6 hours.
it's, yeah.
But if they can explain it and got evidence that they've done it already, and who am I to say they can't do it? I can tell you we'll probably go sit through that class at some time, but
Yeah, for sure. What I was thinking is I tend to tell people don't submit if you don't have to, but if you're really unsure, you can always, I'm just thinking, for instance, not everything needs a submission, but maybe you're not sure and you want to get FRA's opinion on what they think of something. I mean, that you could always email them a question, but submitting it and seeing if it gets approved, you guys will approve something if it's submitted, whether or not it's required. Yeah. Like
yes.
for track safety standards, I don't have to submit my 6-hour initial training program to you and find out that you don't love that. That's short. But you probably would approve it if you can justify it. But if I'm concerned that's not going to be long enough, then I could submit it and have that conversation with you and get the approval to be certain. So that might be a
Yeah,
time.
and I just wouldn't get real hung up on the duration. There's very few that we question the duration on. Some, yeah, we have, but I just wouldn't. I've had people ask me, if I say 2 days and we get done in a day and a half, are you guys going to take exception to that? No. What I would be more concerned is if you say I can do it in 4 hours and it's really taken 8, but because I'm going to probably question that 4 hours right off the bat. But still, even if you run over, we don't care that you run over. Maybe you get into a lot of discussion. That's real hard to do is when you're building training is to figure out the exact duration of a course.
And everyone is different, right? If you're training 2 people, sometimes you're training one instructor, 2 people, you're going to fly through it a lot faster than if all of a sudden you have 15 people.
Absolutely.
Duration is really hard. I agree. We've talked about the same topics and initial training need to be covered. The answer is no. Pretty much covered that, I think. We have a couple questions, but I have one more slide that I hear conversations about, and I just want to hear you talk about it, Cory. And since 214, you've got a lot of experience in this regulation too. But the demonstrated proficiency language in part 214, and I pulled out I have the regulatory references at the end, where it shows up in part 214 for the different qualifications, basically all of the qualifications but roadway worker. What can you talk through? What is this demonstrated proficiency that is in part 214? What does that mean for us?
So the way the track division always defined it basically is it could be a test or whatever. And why they mentioned 243, 201 is to specify the 3 years. Those have to be covered every 3 years, like things that are related to the loan workers watching those qualifications. The annual recurrent requirement in 214 is to go through subpart C. You don't really have to get super in depth into the things required for those qualifications. That would be required every 3 years. And then the demonstrated proficiency, simply a test. Technically, you don't even have to test them on the basic roadway worker, the subpart C stuff, even though this is in subpart C, but
It is.
when you're qualifying them on those duties, there's a lot more stuff that goes into each one of those. We would expect to see every 3 years you're more in depth, and some do it every year, and that's fine if that's the way you want to do it. If you want to knock it out every year, go ahead. But that's why they reference 201 in there, was to set the 3 years for those qualification training on those qualifications.
It's interesting because I think most people think it's every calendar year. I can't think of an example of somebody doing this on the 3-year instead of calendar year cycle off the top of my head. But when you say test, you're saying a written exam is demonstrated proficiency.
Yes.
Test can mean so many things. I just want to.
Yeah.
Better if it's scenario.
They could use their checklists, and we don't require that, but you could you could go out and run them through their checklists and as for their demonstrated proficiency for this requirement.
I do have customers that do that, especially for their RMM operators. I can think of one in particular. In Railtasker, we actually have an option where they can expire the qualified person qualification so that they have to re-demonstrate proficiency just because that one customer wanted it to be set up that way. So that is an option, but that would not be sufficient. Like just demonstrated proficiency wouldn't replace training, the formal training. It'd be just replace the assessment portion, I would say.
Correct, because with 214, the recurrent training, you have to cover the whole reg. But what we would like to see with that regulation in particular is that through your data, say you've had a lot of issues with watchman lookout or something like that, that you would elevate that more, discuss those things that have been found in the field or whatever. And going back to with that, if you did submit it, it'd probably be your initial, same as your initial, I would guess. That's one of those that you're probably going to cover if it was a standalone subpart C program.
Yeah.
You're gonna cover the whole thing, but we would hope that you'd look at your data, and if you had issues with, say, track and time or whatever, that you'd go into that a little more in depth and discuss some of the accidents, injuries, things like that in that class, not just cover A to Z and be done. But technically, if you cover A to Z, you're compliant, right?
Yeah, for sure. I agree. I think it's less meaningful when it's done that way, but it's compliant. We have a couple questions, put up our info here, but I think if you guys have questions, feel free to put them in. I see a couple. We talked about OJT is not required for refresher training, right? Just a confirmation. It is not, on the job training is not included in the refresher training requirement under 243. I feel like we've talked through time requirements quite a bit. I have a question, we'll just say it again, Cory. Can 217 efficiency testing observations, or I guess if you're a contractor and we have a few on the call, periodic oversight, meet the refresher training requirements?
No, it cannot.
Okay. I have a really good question. I'm gonna skip for just 1 second. Does FRA have a spreadsheet that exists that shows the training and what's needed? I think this is the closest. In the compliance manual, there's a bunch of additional details under this column that gives you some details of what that means, but it's not at the subpart level. Is there anything else you can think of?
Yeah, we have our OJT matrix. It's an Excel spreadsheet that's on our website that lists every rule by subsection. It breaks it down whether we expect to see formal training versus a briefing, and whether or not we expect to see T for that. So.
Correct, but on the refresher, it doesn't include refresher.
We are in the process of redoing this a little bit.
Okay.
We've figured out that there's a lot of things like in 213 that when they originally built this, that they're knowledge-based things. So at least for the OJT part, we're gonna hopefully redo some of this.
I have a lot of opinions on this. Which I have sent to
Yeah,
Rob.
I mean, I wasn't involved in it when they first built this.
Oh my gosh.
Now that
Yeah.
Lance Hawk and our team, we've really been looking at this, and especially for 214 and 213.
So what, this is guidance from FRA, and it has a lot of information, but if, to Cory's point, if you go to formal training, because this is someone that you're going to see where FRA says formal training is required. And so if formal training is required, you can see like part 213 immediately is the first one that comes up. Part 213 doesn't currently have a refresher training requirement on the other slides. We know, except for CWR. CWR has that calendar year one, right? For the rest of track safety standards, now we're in that 243 cycle. So that's one way you could go through here. And then you've got 214, which we've talked a lot about. Formal training's required means refresher training's required. Now we've been talking about subpart C on track safety every calendar year, with the exception of that demonstrated proficiency every three calendar years. But then where does that leave bridge worker safety and RMM training? That falls under part 243. So I think you could come through here and be like, where is the formal training? Part 216 is one we weren't normally training on, and now has formal training every 3 years, under 243. I guess you could connect the dots that way. For those of you who use our 243 template and you have the submission and you have the list of our courses and the courses you have, we have a refresher training column that walks you through that at every course level. So you should have that. But if you don't have those resources, that would be one. I think you guys are seeing the 243 matrix. Yeah, Cory, can you see it? I'm not sharing the screen right again. Okay. I don't trust myself now. That was a good question. It wouldn't be a bad thing if you guys ever revisit the compliance manual to add that a little clearer.
That'll probably happen. I don't know if it would be part of the compliance guide, but
some sort of tool, or maybe if you revisit the OJT matrix, but that thing gives me so much heartburn.
Yeah.
That I don't look at it that much.
The other thing why we're talking about our website, hopefully Katie can put it out to everyone on the call, but we did build a job aid for periodic oversight as well.
Yeah.
So that is on the website. You're more than welcome to plagiarize it. That's what it's there for, is to take it, use it. Even railroads, it really, most railroads are saying that they modified their 217 programs. What we're finding, I'll just be honest, we're finding that they didn't modify their 217 programs. They basically said, we have a 217 program. Keep in mind, periodic oversight covers everything in 214, 218, and 220, the workplace safety rules. If them apply to your employees, you need to be testing them on it. And it does in contractors. But it mostly focuses on maintenance way, signal, mechanical employees, but and contractors. But railroads can certainly use it to take a look at their 217 program and go, oh, we're missing a test on this or whatever. And
yeah,
everybody take.
Yeah, we got one question on contractors subs that I want to get to, but I want to add, Cory, so I don't mean to cut you off a little bit because I want to get that sub question, but 100% agree that you guys published that as a tool and it's very thorough and detailed. There's a lot of information in there, and there's some folks on the call who are not association members that could really benefit from that. And again, if you guys are using Railtasker, that's something I would pull out for you and we put it in the app, help you with that. But for association members, just last summer and then again in the spring. The 217 template plan is updated. JR, Mitch, and I, just to look at it through the lens of 243, to Cory's point. For association members, if you haven't revisited their template, there's a new table in there. The 243, there was some tests added to make sure that it was covering all of 218 and 214 and 220. But I have a question not related to refresher training, but we're off the topic anyways already, on subs. And it's something actually I've talked to Lance with at length, but I will pose it. If you're a general contractor and you're using subs, do they need a 243 plan?
Yes, unless they're trained by someone else, like the general contractor does all the training and stuff like that, or maybe the railroad trains all the employees. See, they're an employer, so 243 applies to them. If they employ safety-related railroad employees, then yes, they fall under 243.
Yeah, and I would say as the general contractor, it's your responsibility to make sure that is the case and you have that documentation. It's interesting because the regulation creates that requirement for railroads. It doesn't maintaining a contractor list, right? But it's not a regulatory, I think it's probably this would be more of a legal question, I think, but it seems implied that you would do that as a general contractor. I would say it that way. It seems implied. And that it's your responsibility because they're working on the behalf of you.
Yeah. Well, I think there is some responsibility on the railroad too, because if they're hiring a general contractor, I would think that contract would list the subcontractors. And
sometimes that's tricky though, on contracts. What I'll say from that's not always known from a contractual point of view. Like a lot of times, the general contractor is going to say they're going to be compliant with the regulation, and the railroad's making sure that is the case. But then the general contractor has to make sure they're being compliant with the regulations, meaning if they use subs, that they're also compliant. And 243, keep in mind that those subs are also going to fall under Part 219.
Yeah, and what we found recently is with that scenario is that nobody was doing oversight on the subcontractors. And
yeah, I think there is a high possibility this is going to get clarified in the final rule, which you can't comment on, but I've made some comments that it's ambiguous and that it's more of an implied requirement. And in reality, we all assume that this is the case, but I'm hoping we get clarification. I'll say it that way in the final rule. Because I've put in
probably going to be in the guide, not the final rule.
Or in the guide. Yeah, something from you guys that clarifies it. Yeah, it's funny going through the guide with this presentation, and there's little things I can see where you guys have changed the regulation, and the guide has, it's every time we talk about this is a complex regulation. So we are getting close. It is 12 o'clock Central, so 2:43, we can always fill an hour. If you guys have other questions, feel free to reach out. If you want that periodic oversight tool, Cory, I'll take those if you want, and I'm happy to just grab that off your website and send it to people if they can't find it. Whether you're a railroad or contractor, I'll get you guys that. It's on the FRA's website, but if you can't find it, let me know. If you guys have questions, reach out to either of us. Anything you want to add, Cory?
No, just my contact info's there. Give me a call or email me. I'll get you an answer if you didn't want to ask it today. I want to thank everybody.
Thanks for your time. Have a good day, everyone.
Yep. Thank you.